Welcome to StellarStrategyGaming. This is Mara and Ben. Today we're going to be talking about sorcerers. Now, the way sorcerers are described in the source material is that unlike a wizard or a bard who learns their ability from somebody, or a warlock who makes some kind of a deal to get their powers from a greater being, sorcerers have magic within them. It reminds me a little bit of the wizards in the Harry Potter universe, where they have this sort of raw, unpredictable magic about them. What's odd about sorcerers is while they're definitely powerful, and there's definitely some potential, just a perusing of their spell list means you can take Disguise Self and Fireball, meaning it's a great class if you want to infiltrate the big bad's lair and drop a fireball right in the middle of his dinner table. And because they're charisma based, you presumably have the bonuses to your deception checks to make it happen. It's kind of a forgettable class when we're talking about races and what classes they're logical to play. When we talk about races like the Verdan, like the Changelings, like the Tieflings, that would be logical to be sorcerers, we tend to forget about it. We mention Bard, we mention Warlock, we mention Paladin, but we overlook sorcerers, and they tend to be just kind of a oddly forgettable class.
Yes, and as to why we look over that, I have the theory that our brains are making sort of the innate jump that they're supposed to be constitution-based, but we'll get into that a bit later. For now, the main problem I see with them just right off the bat would be the sorcery points abilities. They're good, objectively. Like, if you want to have a powerful character, sorcery points definitely are the way to go in the early levels. However, they're so incredibly boring. I mean, there is absolutely no flavoring to how sorcery points work or what manifestations there are. Xanathars tries to fix this a little bit. There are descriptions of things like you float a foot in the air when you cast a spell, but that's just casting a spell. It's not using sorcery points. And so for a class centered around these sorcery points, they're not actually all that fun to use, whereas with a paladin, if you're going to cast Divine Smite, oh, the glorious light surrounds your fist as you punch them and a beam of light shoots out. Like, that's kind of awesome, even if it's a bit cheesy. Whereas with the sorcerer, it's like, okay, so my flame goes an extra 20 feet. Woohoo.
I can see what you're saying. You know, when you play a melee class, especially something like most of the fighter classes where it's not clear that there's anything happening other than stabby, it is kind of incumbent on the player to find a way to make that interesting. It seems like with a magical class, it should just be cool, and it should just be inherently cool. Like with a bard being perhaps the best example, you have this massive battle going on all around you, and all of a sudden this guy takes out his lute and strums it like Eddie Vedder working his electric guitar or something. Like, there again, it's kind of silly, but it is really, really cool. And with the sorcery points, since there's no obvious source of what it is, it's hard to really make it work.
Yes, and also, I feel that while I understand having some issues flavoring a new ability, there are definitely a lot of examples in pop culture which show the cooler effects of what could be considered sorcerers using abilities that don't fall into necessarily Fireball. And one of these that I'm going to use is 11 from Stranger Things. She is, by all accounts, a sorcerer, given her powers are relatively unexplained, but she can manipulate objects around her with a nearly magical force. And I would argue that the fact that she gets a bloody nose nearly every time, and the larger what she does sort of takes it out of her, the more power she uses, that's sorcery points, basically. And honestly, that in and of itself could have been a very interesting way to go, is have sorcery points be closer to psionic or psychic abilities that don't fit into a spell specifically, but add abilities which don't exist in current spells. But that's not what we got. And mechanically as well, even the subclasses don't do particularly well making up for this. The flavoring is lacking in the Player's Handbook subclasses, and even in some of the Xanatharian and Tasha's Guide subclasses, they're kind of just underwhelming. I mean, Wild Magic Sorcerer, everyone has a story about turning people into purple sheep, or the plotted plant meme from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And with the Draconic Bloodline, it's just making up for the low hit point count of the class. Let's just be honest here. That is what that class does with its AC bonus, or subclass does with its AC bonus. And it's shown by the fact that you also get resistances, I believe. So it's just overall underwhelming.
Yes, and with the Draconic Bloodline specifically, what you're getting is at first level your hit point maximum increases by 1, and increases by 1 again whenever you gain a class in this level, which is really underwhelming if I'm honest. And when you aren't wearing armor, your AC equals 13 plus your Dex mod, which is not bad. Now, your hit points for this class is 1d6 per sorcerer level, so you're at the level of crunchy that wizards are. And I kind of have a problem with that for a few reasons. One reason is because some of the sorcerer abilities are more consistent with combat, and that doesn't necessarily mean every sorcerer has to be a frontline combatant. They're clearly not built for that, and that's fine. But I feel like this would be so much better if the class reflected the power in some of their other abilities. You know, the Xanathar's Guide gives us the Divine Soul Sorcerer, which the way it described is very much like a demigod from Greek mythology, somebody who has an immediate parent or a close ancestor who was a deity. Same thing with the Draconic Bloodline. You are infused with draconic magic. It seems like you should be tough. I mean, come on, wizards. Let's think more half-dragon and less kobold when we're doing the strength of our characters. Even if it's not a permanent state, it would, how cool would it be if with each of these sorcerer subtypes you could morph into something? You could morph into a half-dragon for a limited period of time as a Draconic Bloodline sorcerer, or you could morph into some sort of celestial being as a Divine Soul sorcerer. Even the Wild Magic sorcerer, morph into an animal and have it be for a random period of time, and have the animal be maybe somewhat randomized. So you're going to turn into something when you roll that 1, and you'll be that thing for some period of time. But as that thing, you might still be able to help the party. If you're a wolf or a bear or a hawk or whatever, you can still attack, you can still interact in a meaningful way. And I'm just going to touch on the elephant in the room, the Wild Magic Sorcerer, and why it's so terrible. I don't want to dwell on why it's so terrible too much because everybody kind of knows, but I was actually looking at this, and my thoughts were, well, if I take the Lucky Feat, or if I'm a halfling with the halfling's lucky ability, or just anything, the thing about it is the way it's worded in the book is once per turn, the DM can have you roll a d20 immediately after you cast a sorcery spell of first level or higher. If you roll a 1 on the Wild Magic Surge table to create a magical effect. So here's the thing, that's not an ability check or an attack, and no re-roll ability that I could find, rules as written, gives you the ability to re-roll that. You don't get that until 14th level. 14th, I mean, that's ridiculously bad. That's just insanely bad. As much as everybody hates the Beastmaster Ranger, if nothing else, they can shoot arrows at the enemy and do something even in the worst of circumstances. This is so awful. Okay, Mario's going to talk before I have an aneurysm.
Yes, and getting into that just a tiny bit more, the other thing is, some people will say, oh, but it's the spirit of the subclass that you have to embrace true randomness, and D&D is a dice-based game, so it's always random. To which I say, you're wrong, because if you think about it, D&D is literally all about how you can manipulate probability in your favor. That is literally what every class is supposed to do in some way, shape, or form. And so the fact that there's an entire subclass which fails to do that and disadvantages the player more than anything else is really a problem. It goes against the spirit of the game to have a class which is literally antithetical to how the game functions. Then there's also the issue that I feel sorcerers shouldn't be charisma. I mentioned this a bit earlier, but why are they charisma? I mean, charisma in D&D, first off, is just poorly defined compared to most other abilities. Everyone knows what strength is, everyone knows what dexterity is. There's some debate between wisdom and intelligence, but even then there's a clear picture of like an old man reading a book for intelligence or wisdom. Charisma, that can be nearly anything. It's a very broad term. And on top of that, not only do we have 3 charisma classes already, but we also only have 2 intelligence classes, and we don't have any constitution-based classes for casting as their main ability. And there is a subclass which uses constitution elsewhere, but I'm talking about the main classes. And with sorcerer, why don't they use constitution? It makes a world of sense to me if the power is coming from within them. I again reference 11 from Stranger Things. She took physical damage when she used her ability because it's part of her. And even if Wizards goes, okay, no, we can't use Constitution because it's tied to your health points, so if you max it out, you're going to have problems, then use Intelligence, because it still makes more sense than Charisma, because you're trying to master the random elements within you and sort of harness this magic for something greater. But we don't get that.
Now, to be clear, we're not reinventing the wheel here with having magic be Constitution base. In Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, the Rune Knight Fighter subclass does exactly that. They have spellcasting ability that's tied to Constitution, which is great. I'm actually really looking forward to playing a half-orc Rune Knight. It'll be a whole thing. I'll probably do a whole video on that particular character because I'm super jazzed about it. Back to our point, though, the X-Men comic book series had a character whose abilities were directly tied to his physical health. He could hurt himself but use more power, expend more power by hurting his physical health. And it comes up in many examples in fiction where somebody is using their own physical strength, their own life force. I think a great way to make the sorcery points make a little more sense, and a great way to balance out the class a little bit, and let that sorcerer get to the front line if that's what you want to do. Hey, you do you. Is give them some kind of ability where a certain number of times between long rests, they get a pool of temporary hit points, and they can expend those temporary hit points like sorcery points. I think that would really work out well for the class. And maybe even let them, at higher levels or whatever, geniuses at Wizards, you figure it out. At higher levels, let them dip into their main hit points. Let them drop down to 0 hit points to do something that's going to save the party. Let people who are playing half-orc sorcerers abuse the hell out of that ability, like half-orcs abuse relentless endurance for everything else. God forbid we all have some fun.
Yes, and those of you who are big Unearthed Arcana fans, first off, you're terrible people. But second, you're probably getting eye twitches right now from some hidden PTSD when he talks about dipping into your main hit points. That is because that ability was characteristic of the Mystic class, which, can you guess what stat it used? Not Intelligence, not Charisma. It was actually another Constitution-based class, and it was the most powerful class in D&D to the point where Wizards basically just gave up on trying to fix it. And I'm not saying that sorcerers should be Mystics. I am saying that if they can make Mystics strong, then they can make sorcerers strong using a very similar method, just perhaps limiting how far they go with it. On top of that, I will again reference Mystics here. Mystics scaled incredibly well. I don't like Mystics. They're too strong, but they do scale very well. The abilities they get at 18th level feel like they belong at 18th level, Whereas with the Sorcerer, you don't get all that much with most subclasses. There are a few exceptions to this, but you basically just get more spell slots and sorcery points. And that's not all that powerful, to be honest, especially not when compared to true magic classes like Warlock or Wizard. And it's bad when I'm calling a Warlock a true spellcasting class. And on top of all of this, it just, with the subclasses, like the Draconic Bloodline, its maximum level ability, I believe it's like Wings or something like that. It's not impressive, and with Wild Magic, it is basically just manipulating how you roll on your table, which, again, should be a fundamental aspect of that subclass from the very beginning. The only 2 subclasses for Sorcerer which do this with any kind of strength would be Shadow Sorcerer and Clockwork Soul. And the issue with them is that they're so incredibly overpowered compared to the base class that it just highlights the issues. Because Clockwork Soul, I'm not going to get into their whole list of abilities, but they have the ability to remove advantage routinely, and it gets stronger and stronger. They can even come back from the dead at higher levels and things like that. And it just highlights how incredibly weak the rest of the system is, because they're the only ones who really get to do stuff like that. And Ben here is going to tell you about Shadow Sorcerers a little bit and why they're also overpowered.
Shadow Sorcerer is so overpowered that it's kind of a wonder that anybody who plays a charisma-based character doesn't take a level in Shadow Sorcerer. Level 1, Eyes of the Dark. Starting at first level, you have dark vision with a range of 120 feet. Strength of the Grave. Starting at first level, your existence in a twilight state between life and death makes you difficult to defeat. When damage reduces you to 0 hit points, you can make a charisma saving throw, DC 5 plus the damage taken. DC 5 plus the damage taken. Granted, if you got hit with a lightning bolt or something like that, it could be a hard spell save to beat. But if you were at 1 hit point and took 2 damage, you have to meet or beat a freaking 7. Also, if you got hit with like a Banshee's ability or even Power Word Kill, I think at that point, it's kind of a DM's call at that point, but at that point it's just a DC 5.
Oh yeah, I that ability is strong. I know, because I badly wanted something like that when I got hit by a Banshee attack long ago.
You instead drop to 1 hit point. You can't use... Now, there does have limitations. You can't use it if you're reduced to 0 hit points by radiant damage or by a critical hit. And you can't use the feature again until you finish a long rest. Still, these are abilities you get at level 1 with the Shadow Magic Sorcerer. So that's pretty freaking hot. And as they level up, at 6th level you get the Hound of Ill Omen, which allows you to dunk on your Beastmaster Ranger in every combat forever, which you absolutely should if somebody's still playing a base Beastmaster Ranger. And it goes on and on. The class is so uneven and so unbalanced in terms of what the different subclasses can do. I feel like, a bit like we were talking about with the Tasha's Cauldron of Everything video, we need a little bit of a consolidation and a little bit of a way to just make the class make a little more sense. I really want to play a sorcerer. I really want to like this class. It's just got a few things really going against it that, you know, it doesn't quite follow the rule of cool.
Yeah, it's definitely no barbarian, as it were. Speaking of which, next time we'll be talking about the Wise Men of D&D, Druids and Clerics. If you want to watch that, please leave a like or subscribe, maybe even comment, as it really shows us that you're paying attention and that you want to see more. And yeah, we'll see you next time.